Hello, everyone. You're listening to episode 12 of the Merge Marketing Podcast. Today is a very exciting episode for those of you that have been thinking about starting their own podcast. I want you to imagine for a moment that your podcast has thousands of subscribers, you love what you do, and you're making a huge impact on people's lives. Well, today we are going to give you the roadmap to starting and promoting your own podcast. Our guest today is Rich Brooks, the host of 2 successful podcasts and a digital marketing expert. So, without further ado, let's merge into the interview with Rich.
You're listening to the Merged Marketing Podcast with David Louch and Jason Hunt. This is a show all about unlocking the marketing tactics and secrets behind everyday brands. Each week, we'll bring you expert commentary so that you can make better choices when it comes to growing your business. Thank you for spending time with us. Now let the show begin.
Well, David, that was a ton of value that we just got from Rich Brooks.
Man, that was an amazing episode. Probably the biggest person in terms of following and influencer status that we've had on the show so far. So why don't
he just came off a stage at Social Media Marketing World.
Honestly, a stage that we both would love to be on one day. But why don't you let the listeners know kind of how you, because this is ultimately because of you. How did you meet Rich and get us into this podcast?
So I've been pretty active recently in going out there and trying to find stages to speak on. So in my effort to just basically spray and pray all of these events throughout North America, the Agents of Change event was one of the ones that I applied to speak at. And Rich came back to me and said, well, typically the people that I have take stage at my conference are people that I have on the podcast. And that begs the question, well, how do I get on your podcast? So Rich said, well, let's have a call. So we had a quick 15-minute chat about my area of expertise, being Facebook ads. And he said, great, sounds good. Let's do this. So and that's where it went. So I went on his podcast. He's got over 320 episodes, I believe.
Yeah.
And so from there, it was a no-brainer for me to go on the podcast. And after I did that podcast, I actually had a lot of people reach out, or a good handful of people reach out and just tell me they appreciated me being on the podcast, thanking me for the value that I brought. But I'm hoping that we can get the Merge Marketing Podcast to that point someday. And I truly believe that this episode here and the value that Rich was able to give us, he gave us a lot of good nuggets of information on ways that we can really push our own podcast out there and tactics that we are not deploying yet.
No, yeah, that's right. And I mean, this was selfishly a great episode for us to learn how we can better optimize our show, but also for those that are out there today thinking that they would like to one day start their own show as well. Man, there's a lot of value in this episode. So,
well, I think people don't want to hear from us. They want to hear from Rich.
They do.
Let's kick it.
Hello, everyone. Thank you and welcome to the Merge Marketing Podcast. Today, Jason and I have a very exciting episode for you. Our guest today is Rich Brooks, the founder and president of Flyte New Media, a web design and internet marketing company in Portland, Maine. He has been interviewed by Inc. magazine, CNN.com, the Huffington Post, and many other news sites, all looking for his insights into online marketing for small businesses. He loves sharing ideas and showing people how they can successfully market their business through social, search, mobile marketing, no matter how busy they are. Finally, as the host and co-host of 2 successful podcasts, the Agents of Change podcast and Fast Forward Maine, he is the perfect guest to be speaking with us today about how to start and promote a podcast. Rich, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, guys.
Really great to have you on the show today. Okay, so before we get started and dive into promoting podcasts and your experience with your podcast and so far, in addition to kind of what I just read, if you could please just share with our listeners a little bit more about yourself. So maybe where you're from, what you were like as a kid, and basically how you got into business for yourself.
Okay, well, there's so many things I could talk about. I grew up in Needham, Mass, which is just outside of Boston, and spent most of my life there until I went off to Saratoga Springs for college, Skidmore College, and then made my way back to Boston, where I was there for a few years. And found my calling in sales. Actually, I never thought I'd want to do sales, but I found myself doing sales, and it was probably the most valuable thing I ever learned was how to do sales. It changed my entire personality, quite honestly. It was fantastic for me. And around that time, I discovered the internet. This is back around 1996 at this point. And while my boss wasn't looking, I developed a website for the company. And he thought it was so great that he took me off the road as a salesperson and put me in the office as a marketer, which sounds great, except that I didn't love some of the people in the office. So I decided that I should really just kind of do this on my own. So that's what I did. I started my company, which at the time was called B1 Communications, ultimately evolved into Flyte New Media, and just started with building websites back in 1997. And at that point, started paying attention to search engine optimization. This was before even Google was around. And over time, just continued to add new services. So it was search engine optimization, and then email marketing, and then social media, and basically anything businesses need really to grow. And that's, the short version of kind of how I got started. Over time, we added people to the team as I got busier and busier, and now we have a nice boutique agency here in Portland of about 8 people.
It's funny when you say 1997 is when you got started. I created 1996, was it?
Yes.
I created a website.
Well, 96 was when I was starting to build stuff, and 1997 was when I started my company. So you're both right.
Yeah. So it's funny if you can look back, because I think about this all the time. I had a website I created on Angel Fire back in 96, 97 that was basically just a website that had profiles for me and all my high school friends. And it was essentially, I always look at it like it was Facebook before Facebook. But if you look back to like 96, 97, Richard, is there anything you wished you kind of would have doubled down on then, or that you kind of would have taken a little more effort in doing?
Well, I guess there's 2 ways of looking at that. One is from a business standpoint, and then one is from the web standpoint. I certainly wish I had bought y2k.com back in the day, and about 100 other domains that I could have flipped for a lot of money. As far as my business goes, one of the things that I just wish I had started on earlier is building up an email list, and maybe just investing both in myself. I would learn things along the way, but I really wish I doubled down on some things like paid search and SEO earlier on. And honestly, I wish I had hired like some sort of financial consultant, because I'm strong in search, I'm strong in sales and marketing, but I never took a business course in my entire life. So the whole financial side of things really escapes me, and I hate numbers, which is why I'm so glad my director of operations is right here in my office with me. She keeps me on the straight and narrow. But getting that outside help in areas that you're weak, like that's something I really wish I'd taken advantage of earlier.
And what did you study in college, Rich?
I was an English major with a concentration in literature. I really thought I was going to be a professor. I loved campus life, and I still love learning. And it was just something I really liked spending a lot of time with. That's what I thought I was going to end up doing.
Interesting. Okay. Well, really appreciate that. Thanks for sharing a little bit about your background. It's always good to hear people's stories and where they come from, especially back to the childhood. So before we start diving too deep into the questions I have for today, I mentioned earlier that you're the host and co-host of 2 podcasts. So we have the Agents of Change podcast as well as Fast Forward Maine. So if you can now just maybe give a brief overview of those 2 podcasts, what they're about, and who you're looking to serve with those 2.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Agents of Change is the one that I run, but I'm the only host of that show. That one's done remotely, and I interview digital marketing experts from around the globe, and I try and find people who have a real expertise or specialty or a unique way of approaching some aspect of digital marketing. So it could be search, social, or mobile marketing. When I first started, if you look at the logo, there's 3 agents on the Agents of Change, and one of them represents search, another one represents social media, and the third one represents mobile. Over time, we've done a lot more with email marketing and webinars and content, and sometimes getting a little bit outside of that traditional digital marketing as well, but I still really like those 3 agents, so I continue to keep them. That show's been going on weekly, and we're up to episode about 340 right now. So that's going strong, and I really enjoy that. and then more recently, kind of out of the Agents of Change, because besides having that weekly podcast, I also put on an annual conference here in Portland, Maine called the Agents of Change Digital Marketing Conference. And it's similar. It's a one-day conference with a bunch of great speakers. Usually they've all come from the podcast who talk about digital marketing. And from that, I had a sponsor in Machias Savings Bank, which is a state bank here in Maine. And they got involved. I have a champion over there who just loves digital marketing, loves what we're doing, got them involved. And then we started to look at ways to expand that sponsorship past one day. And we ended up putting on these workshops, free workshops around the state, usually near the areas where Machias Savings Bank had a strong presence. And we decided to change it up a little bit. And instead of focus just on digital marketers, they wanted to focus on business owners and entrepreneurs and, people who make business decisions. Makes a lot of sense. So we started creating content for that audience. And I had actually bought the domain name Fast Forward Maine like 10 years ago and just didn't know what I wanted to do with it. But my partner, my co-host for the podcast now, Yuri Nabokov, he heard that story and he's like, Rich, this is the perfect time to use that. So I was like, yes, you're absolutely right. So that became the brand, Fast Forward Maine, and it's basically resources for growing Maine businesses. And we decided on a weekly podcast. Originally, it was going to be a Facebook group, but we realized neither of us really like Facebook groups, and we just don't have the personality to keep the conversation going, but we love interviewing people. So that's where the podcast came from. And then we're still putting on local workshops as well.
Awesome. Okay, so that's great. So one of them is more global, probably a lot bigger reach and a lot bigger audience, and then one is more focused on promoting what's going on in the business scene in your local area that you live within.
Exactly. And they're both there to position myself and my co-host as experts. In one, it's supposed to position me as an expert around digital marketing. The other, it's positioning me as an expert in Maine businesses in general, and which is also beneficial for the bank, which is part of the reason why they're such a good partner in this. The second podcast, the Fast Forward Maine podcast, is also a lot of fun because we do the interviews in person, which I don't have the opportunity to do when I'm interviewing people from around the globe. So it's great to actually head on over to the studios, and we've got a sound guy, and he's creating videos of all of us, and Yuri and I are sitting down, and then we bring the guest in, and it's a fantastic experience to be able to do that more like a traditional radio show interview where you can really see the person across the table.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting how we came across one another, or how I came across you, Rich, and that was I was seeking out speaking opportunities, and we spoke a little bit about this prior to me going on your podcast. Was ways in which we go out and find those speaking opportunities, and I found that was interesting as your event did come up on my kind of radar as one of the events to come to. Do you get a lot of people seeking you out from that means in terms of trying to find speaking gigs or podcast opportunities for themselves?
Yeah, and the longer we've been doing it, the more I get those. I mean, I get people reaching out to me to get on the Agents of Change podcast, sometimes 2 or 3 a day. So it does get to be a little exhausting, actually. I might have to look into finding somebody who can kind of vet some of these people. But we've had some people reach out to us for Fast Forward Maine, but it's just the beginning of that. It's like you said, it's a much smaller audience. It's business owners in Maine who listen to podcasts. So it is a smaller audience than the potential audience for something like Agents of Change. And same thing with putting on the event. Now that we've been putting on the event for 8 years, we do get a steady stream of people who want to speak at the event.
I found when, and that's the question. It's figuring out, and I'm interested to hear how you kind of, source out the value that a potential guest would have for your podcast. Because I mean, when we spoke, you kind of didn't really grill me, but you wanted to find out exactly what it is, what the value was that I brought to the table, and then that was kind of the main key point to our entire podcast conversation. Is there a means behind that? What is your kind of methodology to finding or deciding who to have on your podcast?
Yeah, absolutely. Because there's a lot of people who want to come on podcasts because they've heard that all the benefits of being a guest on a podcast. We can certainly talk about that. But so they're just like out there, or their people are just constantly pitching. And I've had my share of duds. You were not one of them. Do not worry. I loved your podcast episode. But it definitely is something where it's just like, I need to really feel that there's a fit for my audience. at least my intended audience. So for me, I envision my audience as marketers or business owners of small to medium-sized businesses who have quote-unquote real businesses, like traditional businesses, not necessarily internet marketers. So it's somebody who wants to learn about YouTube, but not because they want to become a YouTuber. So it's that. And then it's also like, is this something that I'm currently curious about? So if somebody came and pitched me on QR codes, unless they had a reason why they're relevant, again, I wouldn't want them on the show. Or if they come and they're like, I can talk about social media. I'm like, well, that's so broad and vague. I don't want to talk about social media. If you want to talk about how to get more viewers to your Instagram stories or IGTV, that's something I haven't done too much of. Let's talk about that. Or right now, in part because my day job is as a digital agency owner, so we're in a B2B space, I'm really back into LinkedIn. Like I've been getting a lot of traction in LinkedIn. So I'll talk to anybody who's got some tips and tricks from me that I can use. So that's another way to bring people on the show. Now, of course, by the time your audience hears this, it may be that I've already got 5 people booked for LinkedIn. So maybe that's not the best approach to use to get on the show. But again, it's like, what is that very tactical business or a very tactical thing that's going to help my audience? And one of the things that I get pitched on all the time is somebody, basically it's like, so-and-so went from 0 to 6 figures in 6 months, and he's going to come on your show or she's going to come on a show and show you how it's done. That sounds interesting, but it's not my show. And if you did 5 minutes of research, you would have realized we never do those kind of shows. So those are the kind of things that might be great for another show, might be great for, say, a John Lee Dumas, but it's not my kind of show.
Listener bait.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But,
exactly.
It's an interesting, after the show, Rich, I did have a good handful of people reach out to me and just say, hey, thanks so much for the value you provided on that podcast. So you definitely have a super engaged following, and I could tell just by the follow-up.
Oh, that's fantastic. I'm glad to hear that. And, just as far as getting guests goes, I just saw something from Chris Brogan posted the other day. He's like, he never accepts any pitches for his show. He always has to go out and find people. And there's nothing wrong with that approach either. Sometimes I get a little busy. I'm glad when somebody shows up and they have some real value to show me. But I'm also that way. Like I will go when I was at Social Media Marketing World. I took in a number of presentations in part because I wanted to see, is this the kind of person who should appear on my show? Are they talking about the kind of things that I find interesting? Or I'll read a blog post, because I read a lot of blog posts around SEO, and I'll be like, oh my God, that's fascinating. And I'll reach out to this person and be like, do you also do podcasts? I'd love to talk about your blog post on my podcast.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. So I guess kind of leading off of that is just kind of, if you can think of a couple things, 1 or 2 things for each podcast that have really worked for you so far.
Worked for me, how do you mean specifically?
In promoting it. So
promoting it, yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Promoting it. What's really worked?
So there's something, first of all, we have an email newsletter that goes out to both of these lists. I think it's more important at the beginning to send out the email newsletter. In fact, I have been recently reconsidering how we're doing the Agents of Change podcast email newsletter, because chances are after a few episodes, you're already subscribed. So to just see the same content coming in an email, I don't think provides a lot of value. So we've been talking about maybe doing more of a digest, maybe once a month of here were the 4 episodes that we did this month, as well as maybe an additional piece of value for me, like something I'm thinking about in the marketing world or something I saw, and share that. So that may be a change in approach. But for Fast Forward Maine, I know that one of the ways that we get people to tune in is by sending out that regular email newsletter. The other thing is, so for Fast Forward Maine, we want to get in front of as many business people as possible. So over the years, I've developed relationships with a lot of like the Maine Small Business Development Centers and the Maine Small Business Administration and the local SCORE chapters and all these organizations that help Maine businesses. And I subscribe to a lot of their email newsletters, and I noticed almost none of them are providing any sort of auditory content, but there's a lot of people that like auditory content. So I've reached out to a few of them and I've said, hey, listen, would there be any value in you providing some auditory content for your subscribers? If so, we can basically package it up, hand it off to you, And on a weekly basis, you can decide, is this relevant for my audience or not? And if it is, just pop this little blurb into your email newsletter, and you're going to be adding more value to your email newsletter. And we have about 4 or 5 partners, including the Maine Development Foundation, as well as the Institute for Family-Owned Business, which is a local statewide organization. And I think the Maine SBDC irregularly publishes our podcast as well. And that goes out to hundreds, maybe thousands of people throughout the state of Maine, continue with that branding of seeing the Fast Forward Maine logo. And so that's been one of the things that's worked. And currently for Fast Forward Maine, we're throwing some money behind ads on Facebook and Instagram. I question that. The problem is you never know whether this actually works, because you're just not getting the statistics. Even though Apple's gotten better at it, it's so spread out. You don't really get the statistics of that. What was the thing that made somebody actually click through or subscribe? You have information on your website, definitely, but so many people are listening to podcasts through a device, through Apple Podcasts, through Google Play, through Stitcher Radio, or one of the other apps, that a lot of the information of how they actually found you is lost. And so that can be tricky. So to a certain degree, it's a little bit of throwing spaghetti against the wall. That being said, I was just going to say, there are some you should always be having a website, having either show notes or a full-on transcription. You should be creating some graphics that are very shareable on social media. We have a promotion list, checklist every week that we go through for both podcasts. And then we also do things like we send out a thank you to the guests when the show goes live, letting them know where they can find it, all that sort of stuff. Because of something Michael Stelzner once said to me, I don't push people to share the podcast, because what Mike told me is they've already given you a gift by giving you their time. The last thing you want to do is really just kind of keep on asking. I don't know if I have the exact same worldview as him, but I do understand it's like I put the information in front of them so they can share it with their audience if they want to. And if they don't want to, that's okay too.
Let's be honest, we're talking social media marketing world as well.
Yeah. And I also noticed, because I have these 2 different podcasts, that I have very different audience, a very different guest type. So for the Agents of Change, almost everybody I speak to has been on a podcast before. And on top of that, many of them have their own podcasts. So they're comfortable and they know what to expect. With the Fast Forward Maine podcast, many of the people have never, I'd say the majority of people have never been on a podcast before. And they don't know how to basically leverage it. And sometimes they don't even know how they work. Some of them had never heard a podcast before. It's a different type of guest that we're getting on that show. So when we send out our thank you emails, your episode is live, we remind people that, hey, if you've got a press area, here's how you can take advantage of this. If you've got a press area on your website, here's some embed code. Share this on social media. People are going to want to hear it. Because if you're a social media rock star, you're probably giving podcast interviews all the time. So there's only so much promotion you can give to each one, because a lot of times the content is similar. But if this is your first time on a podcast, or you're not commonly on podcasts, or you're talking about a subject you don't usually talk about, there's more of an opportunity for you to leverage that to really increase your visibility.
Interesting. It's what's also interesting, Rich, about this is, you're kind of you're a test, you're a real life test in comparing how to promote a podcast nationally versus globally, because you're running both. And I'm sure it's much easier for the local podcast to drum up a lot of listeners just by sheer word of mouth and networking. Like, one of the big things for us, and probably a large portion of our listeners, are people that attend BNI. I mean, we're pretty big in the BNI and with a lot of local events. So naturally, people are going to talk, and a lot of local people are on our podcast by default. And that's, wouldn't you agree, David?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think whether it's local or global, it's about finding your niche. And you're always going to be more successful when you can really narrow your focus on the type of audience you want, whether you're going to spend money on using Facebook ads, or whether you're going to be reaching out to local business organizations to share your content, whatever it may be. But, the broader you go, the more difficult it can be. So it's a little bit of a double-edged sword.
And now a word from our sponsors.
This week's episode is brought to you by FreshCrowd. FreshCrowd is a full-service social media agency in Canada that specializes in everything social, from management to community building and advertising. FreshCrowd can help your business attract a fresh crowd of people. Visit freshcrowd.com to find out more.
Okay, so far in terms of what has worked for you so far in terms of promoting, heavy focus on email newsletters, show notes, full description, a little bit of social media. Before we move on, and what we're going to move on to next is, what hasn't worked. So in terms of launching your podcast and promoting your podcast, what hasn't worked, how you've overcome some of those major challenges early on. I want to touch on the social media aspect of it, because you did mention that it's very hard to track whether or not that's working. So I'm just curious on, when you're creating those ads on social media to promote your podcast, what is it that you're featuring, and what is your call to action? Are you featuring the episode with that specific person for that week, and then you're just asking people to head on over to your website and subscribe and learn more, or what's the tactic there so far?
So we're not spending any money on the Agents of Change, because we already have a fairly big following there, and I just don't feel like we need that momentum right now. So when we share that on social media, and we tend to do it on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter for both platforms, we generally just create a post, and we varied around, but these days for the Agents of Change, the Agents of Change brand shares it on social media. Then very often I'll go in and I'll share their post on Facebook, say, because it's just, Agents of Change, Flyte New Media, any business is not going to get the same visibility as something that I share. Right. Now, Facebook's not great about sharing or promoting content that links offsite anyways, so that's another tricky thing as well. So that's just something to keep in the back of your mind. But I usually focus on, I always tag the guest, assuming that they are on Facebook, which probably 98% of the people I interview are on Facebook. So I tag the guest so their audience might see it. I talk about what people are going to get from the episode, what I learned perhaps. So I do a little customized text at the beginning of each one, and then I share that. And that's true on LinkedIn as well. And Twitter these days, usually I just click on the tweet button, and whatever goes out, goes out. I don't spend as much time promoting it there as I used to. When we're doing paid ads for Fast Forward Maine, it's a little bit of a mix. We put a little money behind each episode, and then we also put money, and we're targeting business owners and marketers in the state of Maine. And then we also do some overall branding and podcast advertising as well, just to raise awareness for the brand, because it is a fairly new brand. So we want to make sure that people are seeing it.
Do you leverage the podcast? Do you call the podcast as kind of the top of funnel for Flyte Media to bring people in? Like when you go and speak at platforms like Social Media Marketing World, is that call to action, hey, go on over and listen to my podcast, because inevitably they could potentially be a customer down the road?
Yeah, I mean, we have gotten business for Flyte out of the Agents of Change podcast for sure. Like, I know directly we've done that. When I go to an event like Social Media Marketing World, no, my call to action is not necessarily getting somebody on the podcast. When I'm presenting, my call to action is usually about getting their contact information, and I've got a technique for that. It's not about podcasting, but happy to share it if you're curious. But so that's my goal. I want to get them on my list so that I can market to them. And then when I have their email, I can do a number of things, including mentioning to them, hey, listen, if you like Social Media Marketing World and the things that I shared there, I interview digital marketing experts weekly. You can listen, on your commute, whatever it is, and promote it that way. So it's usually a secondary or a third ask at that point. So from the top of the funnel standpoint, yeah, I think it's more of a top of the funnel thing. This is where people are like just doing some research. They're curious about digital marketing, social media, SEO, whatever the case is. They find my podcast maybe because they're searching through the marketing category on Apple Podcasts, or they do a search on it, something like that. So that's one of the ways. When I'm on a podcast like yours, I know I'm speaking with podcast listeners. So in that case, I'm probably going to have the call to action to be, come and check out my podcast. Do I want them to do more? Sure. Throw money at me. Sign up for my email newsletter. That's all great. But the bottom line is the easiest ask is, hey, listen, if you're already enjoying this podcast, you're probably going to enjoy the Agents of Change podcast as well.
Cool. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so this is probably the one that's most difficult for people to chat about. But what were the mistakes, the challenges that you faced, would have done differently early on starting the podcast in terms of launching and promoting?
That is a challenging question. Let me tell you about one bullet I dodged, because I know a lot of people might do this. In fact, it was somebody asked me just yesterday if this was a good idea. And there are people who have different opinions on this. But I was, when I first started, getting into the new and noteworthy on Apple Podcasts was really critical. Like that was kind of how you made your name. And I got in there. That was great. I got a lot of visibility and promotion around that. And then I was coming up to like my 80th or 90th episode, and I was looking at my overall stats, and I noticed that they started to sag a little bit. And I was kind of thinking like, wow, maybe I'm doing something wrong. Maybe I need to kind of, figure something out here. And I talked to somebody, an expert in the field, and they suggested that I shut my podcast down and start a new podcast so I could go back into the new and noteworthy and just tell everybody on the old podcast to come and visit me on the new podcast. And on top of that, I should take some of my old content and then like do one new show a week, but then 2 old shows a week for a while to get all of the old shows into the new format. And I'm like, okay, you're the expert. That sounds great. Let's do that. So I was about to do it. I mentioned more or less on my show, my plans, and I get a call from my friend and mentor, Mike Stelzner, who's like, yeah, that's a dumb idea. And so I'm like, okay, why? Like, it just seems like it's brilliant. And he said, yeah, no. Basically what you're doing is you're asking everybody who's already agreed to follow your show that the show's not worth following anymore, but you should try out this new show. How many people are actually going to do that? You're going to lose a huge portion of your following, all to get into this new and noteworthy thing, hopefully. And really, that's not a thing anymore. Like, that's not the only reason you want to get into new and noteworthy, according to him, was to take a screen capture so you can put it up on your website or put it up on social media. That it really doesn't give you the boost, and there's some evidence to show this, that doesn't give you the boost that you think it gives you. It's really just a vanity metric. So I decided not to do that. But I did want to, at the time, my podcast was called The Marketing Agents. And so he said, listen, just keep everything the same, change the brand. And I did. So if you look at the slug on my podcast, if you go over to Libsyn, it still says something like The Marketing Agents. But since episode 101, it's just been called The Agents of Change. And it was a great move because everybody who had been listening kept listening. No, I didn't get obviously back into new and noteworthy, but I had all that momentum built in. And the other thing Mike told me is to take a look, not just at like the last few months of my reports, but take a look at last year. And sure enough, I saw the same kind of bell curve from the previous year. And it was just more of a seasonal thing when it came to my podcast, not anything else. And I just kind of doubled down on making sure that I was putting out quality content every week, that I was doing the proper promotion behind it, that I was finding high quality guests, that I was delivering on expectations, and the audience continued to grow.
Wow, that is interesting. That is quite the bullet for sure. You were describing that story and I was just like, oh my gosh, this sounds like a nightmare. Deleting the show, re-uploading, relaunching. Interesting. So that was a tactic that a lot of other podcasters were implementing. Was that
years ago? And they still are. People are still doing that. They're shutting down one show to get back, start a new show, which is, by the way, not a bad idea if you're doing a new topic. If you all of a sudden, if you're doing a complete pivot, and if I was going to start a podcast about HR, no, I'm not going to bring along the audience that cared about digital marketing, but it was the same content. It was just a different name. It didn't make any sense. So why would you abandon all those people who have put their trust in you and your weekly podcast just so you can get into new and noteworthy, so you can go after a new group of people? It's almost like you're cheating on your old audience.
Same thing happens with Instagram accounts, and so many people do it all the time with Instagram accounts. Do the old rebrand, but people did not subscribe for the new content that a new owner may wish to release.
There you go.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well, I guess you know better than to do that for the Fast Forward Maine now that that's out and running.
Yeah, no, we're not going to change anything on that.
Perfect.
And that doesn't
Okay.
mean that podcasts shouldn't evolve.
Yeah,
That's a whole nother thing.
of course. Because yeah, what got me thinking there is okay, if getting into new and noteworthy on Apple is simply just a vanity thing, kind of like Instagram followers, then in order to grow, you really just have to double down on the actual promotion. So the email newsletter, the Facebook ads, the sharing, the connecting with the guests, and them sharing it out. Like that's really the tactic there to grow, and not necessarily focusing on things like new and noteworthy.
Yeah. And again, you need to decide what you want to do. I mean, there's some podcast. So another big thing is whether or not how you're monetizing your podcast, right? So, and this is something I almost did. So another bullet dodged is I looked into monetizing my podcast through ads. And based on where I was at that point and having to run a 30-second ad at the beginning, a 60-second ad halfway through, and a 30-second ad at the end, I was looking at maybe making $200 a month. And not only that, I was sure to lose some of my audience who didn't want to hear advertisements. And right around that time when I was struggling with this, I happened to see somebody tweeted out one of my episodes and said, I need help with this. And it was an episode on conversion optimization. So I reached out to the guy. I'm like, is there something I can do for you? We started a conversation that went into DMs, that then went into email, got on the phone with him, and ultimately he ended up signing with my company, my agency, and has been a client since then, like 4 or 5 years now, at like on an average about $2,000 to $4,000 a month of business. That's better than any kind of sponsorship I would have gotten with my podcast. So I think a lot of this has to do with if you can provide value for your audience, it doesn't really matter how big that audience is. I know everybody from a vanity standpoint would love to have a stage where everybody in the world is listening to them. But, with Fast Forward Maine is we don't care if anybody outside the state listens. Like that's not really our target audience. We're here to talk and to be cheerleaders and promoters of the Maine business ecosystem. It's going to be a limited audience, and that's absolutely fine. So knowing what you want to do and how it potentially serves your business, that's more critical than just having the biggest audience possible.
Absolutely. Awesome. So I know for you, you have an SEO background. So how important is that to ranking on Google and maybe getting into the new and noteworthy? Does it have any impact?
Well, it doesn't have any impact on the new and noteworthy because that's completely Apple, and that has mostly to do with, I think it's the first 8 weeks or something like that.
Okay.
There is some challenges with podcasts by default when it comes to SEO in Google. Google just doesn't, I have the Agents of Change. There was a time when we were writing blog posts for Agents of Change and also the marketing agents before that. And the blog posts always outranked the podcast, no matter what we did. I don't know why that is. I have my belief system, which is when you're writing a blog, you're really kind of like carving out those words, putting, the keywords into the right places. There's not that there's not fluff, but everything kind of flows in a very natural way. And I think Google understands that. When you look at show notes, sometimes they're too brief. And when you do a full transcript, all of a sudden it's like people are saying and they're saying and they're kind of going in this place and then they're going over here. The natural rhythm of the English language, spoken English language, does not necessarily optimize well for search engines. So you're going to have to find a middle ground. And we're actually in the process of doing some experimentation, which I'd love to maybe come back on the show at some time in the future when we figured out all this on how to optimize for Google when it comes to your SEO, when it comes to your podcast. There are some things, obviously, that work regardless. One is having a keyword-rich title that people are searching for, making sure that you're using that keyword in the description overview of the podcast episode, maybe even doing some research before you interview the person. So what are some of the common questions that people are asking at Google so that you can ask this and make that part of the show. And it might even be about cleaning up what people are saying. So it's somewhere between show notes and a transcript. So it's an imperfect transcript, but you're really getting the meat of what somebody's saying.
That's interesting because we're in those talks right now. I mean, we're in episode. What episode are we on at now, David? Where are we at?
12.
12. So 12 episodes. This podcast really, Rich, is in its infancy stage, but So we're playing with the idea of having those pages per each podcast episode. And that was a conversation that we had, was having those transcripts and just chucking them right onto that site. In actuality, never thought about that. There's going to be a lot of ums and ahs and a lot of resources to edit an entire transcript. But I do see there's some good nuggets that Rich just gave us there in terms of getting the potentially in a position to rank, right?
Yeah, and we're probably going to go for another 3 to 6 months doing some experimentation on our own for things that we can do both after the podcast has been recorded as well as before the podcast has been recorded. And hopefully once we have some information on that, we'll be able to release that as well. But at the very least, titles, headers, really focusing on some specific keywords, writing up a very keyword-rich introductory paragraph. And then also, if you've got other content on your website that does rank well, that's along the same content ideas, linking from that old well-ranking content to that new page for your podcast episode, that also can be beneficial.
So that's really where I kind of want to round things off, because so far we've really talked about what works and what hasn't worked. And I know you've mentioned a few times that you are testing some things right now that you're not super confident in talking about yet, or maybe that haven't played out. But are there any things that you have been testing, or you like in the past, that maybe are now starting to pay off that you could share with the audience in terms of getting some good growth and reach?
Honestly, the things that I've already mentioned, anything that showed any sort of promise. And like I said, there's some SEO tactics that you can use. We have not figured out exactly how to crack that nut because we've just started the experimentation stage, both on posts that exist as well as how we can optimize before we even talk to a guest. The one thing that I haven't done yet, it's on my to-do list, is there is a company out there called KNIT, K-N-I-T. And they offer a service where they can place advertisements for your podcast in very big popular podcasts. And there's even geo-targeting in there too. So for example, like they may have some spots on a CNN podcast that's business related. And then at the end of it, there'll be, and now check out some clips from your next favorite podcast. And then there would be for Maine people, all of a sudden there'd be an ad for the Fast Forward Maine podcast. So that's one thing that a friend of mine who runs a Marcom podcast has found is the number one way that he's been growing his audience, just as something that I plan on exploring in 2020.
Very cool. See, this is amazing. We're getting a lot of great information from you, Rich. Right now, we're sitting here thinking we're keeners because we've got 2 phones and a computer all recording us live right now. So we're live on Twitter, we're live on Instagram, and we're live on Facebook. So, but it doesn't stop there, that's for sure.
So absolutely. I mean, the whole secret of live video or live anything I've heard is the fact that it's in the replay.
That's right.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And so in terms of your podcast, like during the actual episodes, how are you encouraging people to subscribe to the shows? Is there any sort of verbal call to action or incentive that you provide to them or give to them to get them to subscribe or follow along?
Yeah. At the end of the episode, when I'm wrapping things up, I'll often have some sort of call to action. Very often it is, subscribe to the podcast. Sometimes it's leave a review. Other times I talk about my book. If you like the content you're hearing here on the podcast, certainly be sure to check out The Lead Machine on Amazon or a bookstore near you. Assuming that you live at the bottom of Munjoy Hill, because I think there's only one bookstore that actually carries this. But regardless, something like that. So I'll have some sort of call to action. And when it's conference season for the Agents of Change conference, I'm always pushing people to grab a ticket for the conference because it's just like the podcast, except in real life.
Awesome. And just finally, how has life changed for you and your business now that you have these podcasts up and running and quite successfully? Because there's a lot of questions and people I hear out there talking about how do I really monetize this? It's going to take a while for me to really see any results from my business. They kind of don't really take it seriously. So for the people out there that are thinking it's a little bit too much work or that it can't bring in real business for your business, how have you found it's changed for your business?
Well, it definitely has brought in business. I mean, I can directly, 3 or 4 big clients of ours have come in because of the podcast. All of these clients were outside of the state of Maine, never would have heard of Flyte New Media if not for the podcast. So I know that the podcasts work. But what I've told people before is when I started this podcast, it was because of a lot of other reasons besides just getting business. Like, I wanted an opportunity to talk to some of the biggest names in my industry who might not just pick up the phone if I called and said, hey, I had some questions for you. So I'm able to give back to them by putting them in front of an audience. I wanted for Fast Forward Maine the opportunity to meet and connect with some of the movers and shakers in the business ecosystem who then all of a sudden would be like, oh yeah, Rich Brooks, he's got that podcast. He runs a digital agency. His company does SEO. Maybe you should talk to him. So there's definitely that it raises your visibility. But there was never the expectation for me that I would put out an episode or even 5 episodes of a podcast and suddenly get rich. I did this because I believe in content marketing. I believe in thought leadership. I believe in building yourself a platform, and I believe over the long run it will work. But it wasn't until probably 40 or 50 episodes in that I had that opportunity where the guy shared my episode on Twitter and then said he needed help with that. So if you're expecting to get rich off of just a few episodes, it's probably not going to happen. But if you decide like, hey, I need a platform to grow my business or grow my speaking career or whatever it may be, and I like talking or I like interviewing people, then podcast is a great platform. Just like video can be a great platform, just like blogging can be a great platform. For me, even though I love to write and I love making videos, it turned out that podcast really was where I most enjoy creating content, and it's paid off.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your insights today, Rich. We really, really appreciate it. They were extremely valuable, not only to us, but more importantly, our audience. So for those that are listening today that are interested more in you and what you've had to say, how can they get in touch with you? What's the best way you'd like them to reach out?
Well, obviously, if you're already listening to podcasts, like I said, check out the Agents of Change if you like digital marketing conversations. And I'm guessing if you're listening to the show, you do. So you definitely want to check out the Agents of Change. And if you want to reach out to me for any reason, I'm The Rich Brooks on every social media channel. So I'm pretty easy to find.
Okay, Rich. Well, thank you very much. And we end our episode with a fun question, and that is, if you could choose one person, dead or alive, to represent your brand, who would it be and why?
Oh my goodness. If I could, here's where I stall. If I could choose one person, dead or alive, to represent my brand, who would it be? That's a great question. And the answer is Mel Brooks. He's just got a great sense of, obviously, names. There's the name connection right there. But also, I love his sense of irreverence, and definitely something that I try to inject in everything I do when it comes to marketing is a certain sense of irreverence.
Amazing.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much again, Rich. We look forward to talking to you again in the future, and take care.
Thanks, guys. I appreciate the time. Take care.